All right, so we're going to discuss our average rate of change. If you're following along, this is in Unit 11 on page 28. All right, so our average rate of change of a function is if we're looking at 2 points, and I'm going to use this example to help us out. I want to know, on an average, how much did our function change from one point to the next? So because I'm looking at the change in one variable, with respect to the change of another variable, I'm actually looking at my slope formula. So my slope formula is change in y over change in x. Now the formula we give you, it looks a little scary, but if you notice, if I just represent b and a with x's, f of b is really just y, and f of a is really just y as well. All right, so we're talking really just about the slope between the 2 points. All right, so if you're looking at this graph here, they're discussing an oil company and the number of barrels of oil that are produced per year. So I'm going to use my average rate of change formula, my slope formula, to find the rate of change from 2 different points. So I'm going to find the rate of change from 1912 to 1914. All right, so if I look at my graph, 1912, the company produced about 1,100 barrels of oil. And in 1914, the company produced 500 barrels of oil. All right, so I have my time, which is on my x-axis, and my barrels of oil, which are on the y-axis. So I'm now going to do change in y over change in x. All right, so barrels is y. So 1,100 minus 500 over, now 1,100 came from the year 1912, so that has to come first, minus 1914. Okay, so we have 1,100 minus 500, so we have 600 over 1912 minus 1914 is negative 2. So my average rate of change, average rate of change from 1912 to 1914 is negative 300 barrels of oil per year. Which makes sense because remember the original function was decreasing, so I know that they have to be producing less barrels of oil per year. All right, so now let's look at the graph. So in 1912, remember we said that this was 1,100 barrels of oil. And in 1914, it was 500. So the rate of change from 1912 to 1914 was negative 300 barrels of oil per year, which makes sense because if you check from 1912 to 1913, this is about 900. From 1912 to 1913, the number of barrels of oil decreased by 200. And from 1913 to 1914, the number of barrels of oil that decreased was 400. And if you average the two, negative 200 and negative 400, average means add and divide by the number of terms. You have negative 600 over 2, which is negative 300, which is exactly what we got when we did our average rate of change formula. All right, so let's try another one. Let's take a big interval. So let's take 1910 to 1916. All right, so in 1910, the first date here, we have about 3,400 barrels of oil. Just looking right here. And in 1916, we have about 400 barrels of oil. So now instead of going from this point to this point, finding the change, and this point to this point, finding the change, and just finding all of them and averaging them, because that's just a lot of work, I'm going to just use my slope formula to find the average rate of change over the course of the 6 years. All right, so change in y, oops, over change in x. My oil is my y, so 3,400 to 400 over 3,400 was with the 1910, so I have to write 1910 first, minus 1916. All right, so I have 3,400 minus 400, which is 3,000, over 1910 minus 1916 is negative 6. 3,000 divided by negative 6 is negative 500 barrels of oil. Barrels of oil, we should say average barrels of oil per year. Okay, and now they can ask you this question a bunch of different ways. So if you're in the packet, we can go now to page 30, number 1. All right, so they can give you a function with a table, and then they can ask you for the average rate of change. And then I have to give you the interval. So they're saying when you go from 1 to 5 on the x-axis, what's the average rate of change for the function? So change in y over change in x. So my y value for 1 is 77, and my y value for 5 is 41. So 77 minus 41, and then 1 minus 5. Okay, so 77 minus 41 divided by negative 4. So my average rate of change is negative 9